Mayor Wu, it's good to see you. How are you?
You. Thank you for having me,
What-
as
what-
always.
what'd you bring?
Mayor, the Science, Museum of Science.
I brought a little swag today
A
from
lovely bag.
Museum of Science tote bag. It came from our recent amazing announcement event where we were sharing with all of the partners and community members that Boston's Free Museum and Cultural Institution program is now going to be open to students from every school in the city, not just Boston Public Schools as our pilot was, and we're adding even more institutions to the list of the spaces that they can go for free with their families.
That is, just elaborate on that a little bit. Is it any day, some days? How does it work?
So it's the first and second Sundays of the month, and starting in the new year in January, next month, it's happening fast, students will be able to sign up for the program and then show either their little sort of code or the email from the program to be able to get in for free at 9 institutions. It's, okay, let me see if I can do this. The Science Museum, Children's Museum, MFA, ICA, Zoo, Aquarium, the Museum of African American History, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and the Kennedy Library and Museum. And they can bring 2 adults, or actually 2 guests, whoever they are, of any age, with them whenever they go.
That's great.
And the major thing is the expansion. It's not just public school kids. It's any school kids in Boston as of now.
Open to all.
You know, speaking of January, before we get back to some of the news, and the number's 877-301-8970. You mentioned January. I believe you're having a child in January. Is that?
I hope. I will have gone through a lot if that doesn't happen.
We and virtually everybody else in the media has discussed with you how you're going to do this. You're not taking a leave. We discussed that with you a couple of months ago. How do you plan to govern? What's going to change when you're having this third kid of yours, Mayor?
So I think, as I've talked to a few people, as Jane Swift describes it, a working maternity leave. But basically, you know, this is a job where when important decisions have to be made, I'm there to make those decisions, whether I'm on vacation with my family or at whatever hour of the evening. Certainly, a lot of the how I do the job is going to change while I'm recovering and making sure that the baby and our family are settled. So I'll be working from home a lot more. I've had a lot of great conversations. I'm very grateful to the City Council President as we're sort of coordinating on if there have to be public appearances, and it would be great for her to represent me at certain events. So we're already mapping some of that out, and I'll be checking in with my team on a very regular basis, doing a lot more Zooms and trying to participate from there. And, you know, this is the third go-round for me, although in a different job, this role versus being on the City Council. But we will see when the delivery happens, how that goes, and I'll take it a little bit day by day. But the plan is that we have an amazing cabinet, set of department heads, team, staff all around the city, and things will continue to run very smoothly.
I'm embarrassed. I don't know what a mayor's formal responsibilities in one month as opposed to another, but is anything happening in January that is not going to happen in January or that's moved? Or?
Right, yes. So the big thing is our State of the City address,
Oh, that happens
which
in January.
usually
Of
is
course, right.
somewhere around the first or second week
Yeah.
in January. The due date for the baby is January 15th, so rather than trying to manage the unpredictability of all of that, our plan right now is to shift that speech delivery event over to March, and so that will give a little bit of time. I'll be able
That's
to.
right.
It's a big endeavor, and we take it really seriously in terms of mapping out what's happening for the city. It's also the longest speech that I give all year, so even just being able to be on my feet and deliver that for the 25, 30 minutes, I want to make sure we're doing that right and treating it as seriously as usual.
You don't want to go into labor in the middle of the State of the City address.
How are you feeling, by the way? Are you feeling okay?
I feel good. At 5 weeks to go, anyone who's been through it or seen someone go through it, you can only feel so good at this point. But I feel as good as that.
Okay, why don't we get some calls? 877-301-8970. I am going to brutalize this name, so apologies in advance. Is it Kaliga? Is that how the name is pronounced?
Yeah, my name is Kaliga.
Oh, I got it. Kaliga,
Great.
welcome
Thank
to
you
the
for
show.
calling.
You're on with the mayor.
All right. Hi, I'm Mayor Wu.
Hello.
I would like to talk to you about White Stadium. I am very much for, as are most people in the inner city, to have White Stadium rehab because it is a trust of Boston Public Schools, children, and community youth. I live in Jamaica Plain now. I grew up in Roxbury. And I have some points that I think have been kept from the public that I'd like to just make. First, the lawsuit is alive and well, opposing a professional sports enterprise in a public park. We recently had a win where a judge granted us more time for the discovery process. And I want to tell you that I am a soccer mom. My kid plays, one of my children currently plays soccer for Tech Boston. And I would love a women's soccer team in the Boston area. It doesn't belong in green space.
Hey, Kaliga,
At all.
Kaliga, we need you to get to a question because their lines are full. So what would you like the mayor to address, please?
And I also want to tell
That went
people
well.
that it would cost a heck of a lot less to fix White Stadium we've done studies, 8 to 20 million versus the original 50 million that the city taxpayers, even if you float a bond, there's interest on that, so it's going to cost us
Okay, your
more.
question, Kaliga, last time.
Yeah, we need the question.
Is there a question for the mayor,
It's
please?
now up to 91
Okay, Kaliga,
million.
thank you for your call. We appreciate it. There is litigation that is pending. We know that there appears to be the possibility, according to some reporting in the Globe, of a delay that may cause the professional soccer team not to be able to play there in their initial year in 2026. We know the city's share has gone up from 50 to 91 million, which is, I assume, what Kaliga was representing. So where are we in this terms of this plan? And I'm sure you read Shirley Young's terrific piece where she basically raised the question, why isn't the women's soccer team doing what every other women's soccer team, I think it's every other women's soccer team except one in America, does, and attempt to play in the men's professional soccer team, which theoretically would be the thing in Everett.
Yeah, and I think that's what I heard from Kaliga's underlying question as well, is what are we going to do about it? Why are we still moving forward? And I appreciate her advocacy and alongside all of the other folks who've been involved in the lawsuit and joined that, because we know the public, anytime in the public sector when we take actions, we have to be able to guarantee that there's transparency about what we're doing, we're clear about the goals, and that this will serve the public benefit rather than the potential for sort of what she's expressing concern about of a private entity crowding out the public or things like that. So first, just a couple points that Kaliga referenced. Those are really good points. The lawsuit. We did have I forget what the formal name is, but there was a check-in, basically a session with the judge earlier in the week. The goal was to address a motion that the plaintiffs had put before the court to delay the trial, which is scheduled for March. And so there were some issues around whether there had been full time to review all of the documents that had been produced by discovery, and therefore could the trial at the plaintiffs were asking be moved further back from March. And the city's position was that we really, we had already had a first initial ruling from the judge saying that the project could proceed while the litigation was ongoing, because she did not see reason that it should be halted or stopped, and that she did not believe that ultimately the plaintiffs showed a case that they would be successful in suing the city on this. So the decision as of just a couple days ago was in the city's favor, in terms of just this particular motion, that date will remain in March and it will not get pushed back, and so therefore we won't delay the ultimate resolution of this case. She did give a few more days for the deadline for everyone to be able to review and respond to the documents that have been produced, so we're happy that everyone feels like they have enough time to respond. Our main concern was we want to keep things on track with that March date, and that was affirmed in the court very recently. The second point around the cost. So, as she mentioned, maybe some groups have been saying, well, why couldn't you just spend $8 to $20 million on renovating the existing stadium? We all have, I think especially neighbors, have seen what the condition is. We've heard from student athletes. It is on the verge of being unusable in some aspects of it. State track organizations and other athletic associations refuse to certify the results or the times that our students are achieving on the track because they say the facilities don't meet the standards to be able to officially count those. And it's just the size of the track. It doesn't allow us to host any of the statewide meets because they're not up to the standards of today. This was built in 1949. So at $8 to $20 million, sure, we could repaint some things. Sure, we could make some cosmetic changes, but it would not allow us to really take things to the next level. And what we have here is a partnership where a team will use the stadium for a certain set number of days a year. There are about 13 home games that are played right now in the National Women's Soccer League. If they make it to the finals, there might be more games on that. And they would have a practice at the stadium before each one of those games as well. But other than that, it remains under the ownership of the Boston Public Schools. It remains prioritizing student athletic uses, and we would dramatically expand the hours open to community, the usage and usability of the fields and the stadium itself, and it would allow us to host the events that our students deserve to have happen right here in Boston, to give them the facilities of a new professional standard 8-lane track, professionally maintained grass field, training space, locker rooms that are fit, water and plumbing that works all throughout the year, unlike it is now. And so this is a partnership where the soccer team would lease their usage of the stadium, but they would contribute significantly more than half of the construction costs, and then maintain, have the resources where they would maintain the facilities forever forward, so we don't fall into a situation again where something is built up and then begins to crumble over time. We believe very strongly that this is in the public interest, and we've had hundreds of meetings where the project has changed in response, and that's why the costs have shifted as well. There's usually a placeholder amount put in. The costs are adjusted for construction realities, but also in response to the changes that communities have asked for, and we still are getting the the deal that we believe is going to serve Boston and help transform this opportunity.
You had questions about Boston 2024 Olympics, if I remember correctly, and part had to do with cost overruns. So in recent times, the city's $50 million share went to $91 million. And if history is a guide for almost any public construction, the likelihood of $91 million becoming more is, I assume, not unlikely, let's put it that way. Who is responsible for cost overruns? And just to add to that question, the person who suggested, and maybe this is where Kalika got it from, that a stadium could be in perfect shape, using Lowell as an example, is Andrew Zimbalist, who in the spirit of disclosure, I wrote a foreword to a book that he and Chris Dempsey wrote about the Olympics proposal in 2024 that they helped kill. With this doubling of the city's contribution and with the Everett decision having been made by the legislature, you're not doing any rethinking about the potential huge cost to the people of Boston here, and maybe there's a better idea?
So this has been part of the same conversation for the year or so that we've been engaging with the team and the community. I think there's always been in the background this conversation really for almost a decade now, or maybe even more, about whether the Revs would get their own stadium closer to Boston. And so this was always in the mix, and we've had some conversations with the MWSL themselves about it, where they have shared that, in fact, the move now is for many of the professional women's soccer teams to move towards their own spaces, because they don't have to feel like they need to be overshadowed or share. And in fact, the places where they're playing in their specific space, their locker rooms, their home turf, it has filled those spaces, and the number of the degree of interest in supporting professional women's soccer right now and professional women's sports in general is off the charts, and they deserve to have their own stadium. That, again, this is their perspective. So we've been engaging with them as they have been thinking through all these pieces as well. The team came to the conclusion that they wanted to do it in the city as their own stadium, with the benefit primarily accruing to students and our community members
as a
contribution.
But how about your perspective? I mean, again, almost doubling of the cost with the likelihood that it's more. That's a huge ticket item. I mean, I guess
it's a big item in our capital budget.
But have
it's
you considered
that
a more modest alternative, or are you sticking with it here?
The costs of renovating something that has been falling apart for 40 years are significant. And what we have here is an agreement where the city will reconstruct half of the stadium with all the amenities for our students and community members, and the team reconstructs half of the stadium. Each side is responsible for what happens with costs on either side. And I will share that the increase in costs has happened on both sides, on the city and the team, and we're working towards the final lease details, and I think that will become clear. One other difference between the Olympics and this is that we're about to start construction immediately, so we have a much better handle of what the costs are now.
But it went up 41 million just a couple of months.
Well, I will say, whenever you look in the capital budget, the first time something gets assigned an amount, it is a broad estimate. So even in terms of the internal adjustments to have the contingency for costs going up, and then the changes that were made in response to community, it's not unusual for our first draft of the capital budget as a placeholder to see some significant growth as projects move through the design pipeline.
Okay, then one last question, then we'll move on. Same question Margie and I asked John Fish, who was leading the effort for Boston 2024 years and years ago. Can you guarantee the taxpayers of Boston that if the price goes over 91 million, that they won't have to pay for it?
If the price goes over for our
The
half of
city
the
share,
stadium,
yeah.
so we are going to pay for our half of the stadium no matter
No
what
matter
it costs.
what number it
Yes,
goes to.
but we're about to begin construction, and we feel
Okay.
that the estimates that we have are going to be in the ballpark of what is needed, and that this overall is going to be a deal that is worth it for generations to come for our city.
We're talking to Mayor Wu, 877-301-8970.
Don in Dorchester, you're on with Mayor Wu.
Hey,
Thanks
Don.
for calling.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Don from Dorchester. I'm active in the Columbia Savino Civic Association. I had a huge complaint, Mayor, about the Zoning Board of Appeals. It's awful. It's disgraceful, and I really asked you to change it, improve it. But I want to put it in context first. The Civic Association has approved the 10,000, let me say that again, the 10,000 proposed housing units in and around the Columbia Savino neighborhood. So we're not anti-housing, just the opposite. We are pro-housing. However, we want that housing done properly, and we want it planned appropriately. Now, we also, at the other hand, we also want to maintain the character of our neighborhood, where we have singles, two families, triple deckers, happily coinciding. The Zoning Board of Appeal right now is a green light for any developer to do whatever they want to do in the neighborhood.
Okay, your question, Don, is what? Please?
Please, Mayor Wu, fix the Zoning Board of Appeal. And I'll give you a great example.
It's got to be 15 seconds because there are dozens
all right,
of people.
20 Hinckley Street was approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals, and in writing, the Zoning Board of Appeals said they did it because of community support. At the meeting, there were 6 people, 5 spoke against it, 1 spoke for it, and the Civic Association person spoke against it.
We got it. Don, thank you much for your call. Mayor?
Thank you, Don. It's great to hear from you. Don actually has this incredible one-pager that lists out all of the 10,000 units that he's describing, and he's been an amazing advocate for wanting to have a plan outside of just the individual parcels for transportation infrastructure, and all that will be required to move that many people. And so thank you, Don, for also showing up and always being at the Morrissey Boulevard reconstruction meetings and all of that. It's been great. In terms of zoning, I completely hear the concern that when we have a system that feels like it's based on the sort of battle for each individual parcel and how do you assess community support, does one person speaking on behalf of a group get more weight on their opinion than 5 people who aren't speaking on behalf of a group necessarily? And those are all questions that I think show that we don't have a system in place right now that is serving the predictability for all sides. And that's why we've been working to try to get around to rezoning the entire city so that our zoning code will actually be real. Now, there will always be exceptions. There will always be a need for particular circumstances to have an outlet and a valve through the Zoning Board of Appeals to address those unusual circumstances. But I agree that feeding the sort of standard of all construction through that leads to these situations where people don't feel heard and don't feel like it fits with the larger plan. And that's why we've moved away from the off-the-books BPDA to a real city planning department for the first time in decades. undergoing zoning reform, and I will make sure that our chief of planning and team get as caught up on the 10,000 units and that conversation as we've been involved in now that Kairos Gen is in place.
Don, thank you much for your call.
I think a lot of people in Boston and in small towns are suspicious of the zoning boards of appeals. They wonder if it's stacked with real estate developers and people that have other interests that may not be with the larger community. So how do you get on the zoning board of appeals in Boston? And are there restrictions for real estate developers?
Yeah, there's actually, it's one of the boards where there are specific nomination pathways for some of the seats. And so, and it requires nomination, appointment by myself, and then confirmation by the city council. So there's a little bit of a vetting process. I can't remember the exact names of all the groups, but usually there's some provision for labor and the construction trades to have a seat, for the contractors to have a seat, for the Greater Boston Real Estate Board to have a seat or to have a nomination. And usually the requirement is that they nominate a certain short list of people, and then whoever's mayor picks one of their lists and puts them forward. And then there are a few
so
that are...
So it sounds like they're outnumbered by people whose interests are building as
No.
much
There's
as
also
that.
seats that are, what are called at-large
Okay.
or neighborhood seats.
And do
where
you
have to
appoint
have
them new with your administration, or some holdovers from the Walsh
They're,
administration?
I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 year terms or something
Okay.
like that. It's a multi-year term.
Okay.
And so, theoretically...
So you think the checks and balances are there for people that are worried about shenanigans at zoning boards of appeals, not just in Boston, but in general?
Well, our system is a little bit different than other places, so I can't generalize across the board. I will say that we have seen a majority of the board turnover since over the last 3 years as terms have expired, and we have, in our administration, really worked to put in place people with specific expertise, even if not required by law, in planning, in climate, in transportation,
Okay.
to have that fuller picture.
Okay.
So we're always trying to do better and be more transparent, but these are hard jobs that pay a teeny tiny stipend, but they're basically volunteer jobs. And I know the folks who are on the board, both the members and the alternates who constantly get called in to fill in, they are doing their darndest to make sure that they're representing the whole picture of what our community needs.
Can we spend 30 seconds, then we got to take a break, on something that I consider great, assuming it's true. Flower Bakery has gone to
Yeah.
the old
Oh,
urinal.
I'm so excited.
Well, I shouldn't say old urinal. It was
Yeah,
an
it
old
was the
urinal.
Earl's.
And then the Earl of
Yeah.
Sandwich.
But how great
Flower
is that?
Bakery's going to the Common.
Yes, exactly.
When is that happening?
They are entering now into a period of trying to do some of the inside renovations and changing things over. Should happen in this. It'll officially be open in the spring.
That is fabulous.
But the great thing is, on the way to
Fabulous.
the city parking garage, or getting on and off the T right there at Boylston Street, or even if you want to walk over from Arlington Street, you can go to Flower Bakery. You're supposed to have to worrying about a place to park over where
great.
you are in MIT or Cambridge.
Or at special events like
Yeah.
Shakespeare on the Common.
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, it just shows there's a lot happening downtown, and we're excited that such a beloved local business is also investing
Yeah.
in it.
You know, Mayor Wu, we've talked to you a lot about your efforts to raise taxes on commercial real estate to offset the tax hikes that would be received by the city. Turns out they weren't as high as you thought they might be, but the whole plan got quashed by the state Senate. What do you think?
Well, it's been an eye-opening experience, that's for sure. And I think I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I will try to share as much as I can, and maybe we'll get into a little bit of depth on just this topic, because it's been quite an intensive process. I think where I want to start is, every day in city government, our responsibility is to deliver results every single day of the year. We don't have time at the city level to play games. And I took this process, and many, many residents, seniors, neighborhood leaders, advocates, union workers took this process very seriously, because this was about delivering results that are needed for people who are going to face real consequences. There was a problem that was identified, that with national economic shifts happening, that the commercial office and remote work changes would have an impact on budgets and taxes, and in our case with state law, cause a potential spike in residential taxes. And this was, there were various headlines calling this out in the media as well, even examples and cases of buildings, commercial buildings that sold for far less than they were purchased for, and there was a sense of even calling on the city, how could it possibly be that we're not treating this as an apocalypse with collapsing commercial sector? Why aren't you doing something faster? And we were taking our time to really analyze the situation and make sure we understood all the data, because it's impossible to predict valuations. It's an annual process that starts in January, ends in December, 180,000 parcels. And so we were working through that. And as soon as we knew and had arrived at the conclusion that there could be an issue, we filed legislation to address that. It was a fix that would be proactive, that would stabilize taxes for a multi-year period of uncertainty, and that would ensure that this would work because it had been proven to work before. Now, 8 months later, right, I just realized the other day that I was not pregnant when we started this process, and I am about to pop now. And we still never got a final vote on it from the Senate. What happened was...
Well, Spilka, the Senate president, did not allow there to be a vote. Is that correct?
One senator blocked it 3 times procedurally, and there was never a vote.
You're talking about Nick Collins?
Yes.
And Nick Collins, who's from Boston, he's a Boston rep, is part of his
Senator.
district is Senator, excuse me, part of his district is South Boston. We should point out that he got, public records show that he got real estate interest donations to his funds, his campaign funds of $25,000 in October,
and
November,
I
compared to $1,323 at the same time.
I'm not,
in
and I don't. All of those kinds of articles happen about all of us. I think they're relevant. It's important information. I, have political support from some of the people who I'm on the opposite side of policies as well, and so it's hard to draw individual motivations just from that. But I will say that this was a proposal that had been passed twice by the City Council, twice by the House of Representatives, overwhelmingly. That had been, the city had been required to, as a condition of moving forward in the Senate, come to a deal with business groups, which we did in a process of good faith negotiations that took a lot of energy and time, down to fighting over the last 0.5 percentage point in year 1, and then the last 0.5 percentage point in year 2 and 3. We struck a deal knowing that there was uncertainty in this process, precisely to give predictability and to give the city the proactive tools. The numbers would shift, and we are very glad that they didn't shift in a worse way beyond, to the worst case scenario. But if the numbers had shifted that way, the city wouldn't have been walking out of the deal just because suddenly it was worse than we anticipated. So when it got better for businesses, when the valuations actually came back not as dire as had initially described in a potential worst case scenario, this was still within the original range that we had presented of a margin of error. And then people did not honor the results of the process. And, it had just felt like there was one goalpost after another. I will run through any set of requirements to do what is right for our residents and to fight for the people that need this. And so I think, for me, what's most heartbreaking is that the very people who will be most impacted by this are used to things like this happening, are used to being ignored and left aside and, pushed to a later date because big business interests say it's not serious enough or there's other priorities. And a lot of this is in a larger process where people who don't have any direct stake in our neighborhoods have a lot of say. And we got to the point where any single senator, and it wasn't necessarily going to be the one who actually ended up being the procedural
Nick Collins
move,
from
but
Boston.
it could have been any senator at that point. I'd reached out
Did he
to
ever
all 40.
bring up to you his concerns right before the vote? Did
No.
he ever voice them?
No, I mean, it is what it is at this point. I will say my team worked incredibly hard, and we had reached out to, we'd had multiple public hearings where these concerns had not been raised. We had dozens of phone calls.
He never raised the concerns before.
We had,
Did he?
no.
Here is what he had to,
yeah.
if I may, here's what he had to say during Monday's Senate session when he postponed it. Again, here's South Boston Senator Nick Collins.
This matter before us was negotiated with the Boston City Council, the legislature, and stakeholders based on false information. Whether that was intentional or not, we don't know. And now we know the sky isn't falling, and the campaign of fear and manipulation that took place and continues to take place is a farce.
The campaign of fear and manipulation that took place and continues to take place is a farce. I assume he's talking about you. What's your reaction to what
Yeah,
he
look,
said?
I don't want to make this about one person because I think it has become clear that there are, this is coming from a number of places, including some businesses that did not have to put themselves publicly on the record. And so, he's carrying a message for a larger group. But I want to address the message, which is somehow that in doing our very best to head off a situation that is going to harm residents, and granted, could have been worse, and we're thankful that the numbers did not end up being in that worst case scenario, but we stated every single time that these are subject to lots of changes and will shift. The deal was struck with that context, that there would be uncertainty, and this deal coming to an agreement. When the senators from Boston sat at the table, the Senate president was at the table, they invited the business groups to the table, and all of the senators did not say a word about any individual changes they wanted to see. The instruction was work it out with the business groups, and we are good with that. So we did, and that arrangement was about a 3-year period where we still don't know what will happen next year or the year after that or the year after, next year meeting after this upcoming fiscal year for the next 2 years. And so that multi-year predictability was important and part of the deal. And so the numbers shifted within the range. It is not typical to offer these early estimates, but in answering every question that was asked, in having briefings with so many senators, we had a great meeting with the Republican caucus of the Senate. They asked incredibly insightful questions. So every single place that we could, we really tried to be as open as early as possible. And so I think, people are going to say what they need to say when they maybe feel that residents
But how do
are
you
going to
feel
see what's
this
going
guy
to happen.
Represents Boston, and he's talking about fear and manipulation. What's your reaction to that?
I think that could either be misleading or misinformed in terms of, that particular.
Well, can we get
his
concrete?
particular
He
understanding.
said you originally, the highest number I ever heard you say is you said 33%, but it's only for half a year. 16.5%. It ended up at 10.4%, which is the critics have stated is barely only a 1.5 higher.
But
than what the,
I
let me just
wanna
get the
walk through the
facts out.
numbers.
The average
Yeah.
rate is for 9. But I guess my question is, at least 3 times, Mayor,
Yep.
that I'm aware of in the last year, the state legislature has decided that the real estate industry is more important than the duly elected representatives of the people of Boston. There was a real estate transfer tax on wealthy transfer, high cost transfers to fund affordable housing. You proposed, that was killed. You proposed the rent stabilization thing, that was killed. This, whether people agree with this or not, this property tax shift also was killed. Is it unfair to say that they care more about what the real estate industry says than what you say?
No, that's not unfair at all. But I just want to add, though, it's not about me. It's about the residents of the city. And it has felt, and it has literally been where I've been sitting at tables where there are multiple representatives of business or the commercial sector, and no one besides myself invited to that table to speak specifically for residents. And my job is to represent both, right? We cannot have a thriving city without a thriving economy and businesses, and we are doing everything we can to address the challenges there. But residents deserve to know that they are prioritizing the process, and it's heartbreaking to feel like that hasn't happened. Can I just spend 2 seconds on the numbers, though? Because this has been a lot of confusion. So there were 3 different numbers that were put out, and each has been represented in 2 ways, so it's confusing. We've talked about a bill-to-bill increase, and the reason is because the bills are issued on a fiscal year basis for the city, which runs from July 1st to June 30th, but the tax assessments are done on a calendar year basis by state law from January to December. The first 2 bills of the year are always with the last year's tax rate artificially low, and then if the rate goes up, you have to make that up by paying higher bills in the second half of the fiscal year or the first half of the calendar year. So what people feel is the double the annual increase when they get that January bill. And you could say, well, it's going to average out to half of that if you count the 2 months that they paid artificially low and then now 2 higher. But when you're on a fixed income and all of a sudden you have to come up with an amount that day, we like to cite that as the impact that they felt. So The first set of numbers that were put out was a 33% bill-to-bill increase, which, as you said, is a 16.5% annual increase averaged out. And that was based on, at that point, the city had not gotten far enough into our process to have any numbers at all. We said that very clearly. We used numbers that the Boston Municipal Research Bureau put out as their estimate. It was something like commercial values will drop by 10%, residential values will increase by 5%, and that was one scenario. And we translated that into what the bill-to-bill and annual increase would be. The first point that we had real data to give our own estimate, again, subject to change, was about late September. And so we shared that within a margin of error, there was the worst case scenario of our, I think the estimate was that instead of going down by 10 on commercial and up by 5, it was something like down by 5 to 7 on the commercial side and up by 3 to 5 or something on the residential side. So we said that could translate into something as bad as a 28% bill-to-bill or 14% annual increase, subject to change with this margin. The final numbers ended up right within that the range that we had given. Commercial dropping 5, residential going up by 3, which results in a 21%. So we went from 33, which was an outside estimate, to 28, which was our own estimate, to 21. Now everyone says that, well, and 21 is 10.5 annualized. And everyone's been saying 10.5 is close enough to 9. 9 is the 5-year average. That's what business groups have been holding on to. It's important to even put that 5-year average in context, though. These 5 years have been the highest 5 years in a very long time in Boston. The 10-year average is 5%. The 15-year average is a little over 4%. So if you remove these last 5 years, the city's been at about a 2 to 3% annual increase. And so 10.5 coming after 5 years of an average of 9 is extremely high, especially, again, for those residents who will be most impacted by this. And so there's been a lot of choosing the right numbers to make your best case and not listening to the people who are going to have to bear this and who are the ones who make up our workforce, make up our community. And it's just saddening to feel like this is the process that so much has to go through every single session. We came to a deal with the council. The House had some concerns as well, but told us what they needed to resolve those. So we made those amendments and came to a compromise. They passed it twice. And then on the last step, the goalpost kept moving, and then we came to a deal, and then even that deal, when there was an opportunity, it felt like to, point to some outside factors, didn't end up holding. And so it's been hard for me to feel like I can vouch for a sense of wanting to build trust in these processes. We are going to always continue to fight for what's right for our residents. We've done that in this case. We will continue doing that. And now we're going to have to try to find extraordinary ways to support people, because an increase is happening that there was a common sense way to have avoided and stabilized that would have been in everyone's best interest.
And I just want to repeat before we leave this topic, you just played sound from State Senator Nick Collins criticizing essentially this process and criticizing the mayor. And I'll read from the first paragraph of the Globe. That same Nick Collins, Boston, whose constituents will be impacted by these tax bills, received tens of thousands of dollars in donations from prominent members of the city's commercial, real estate, and hospitality industries in the weeks leading up to his move to delay Mayor Wu's proposal to hike commercial property taxes. All told, $25,000 in October and November, public records show, almost all of it from real estate interests. By comparison, 2 years earlier, when he was up for re-election, he received not $25,000, but $1,323. And I think you don't want to make it against one person, but I think it underscores people's lack of trust in the legislature, which I suppose is why the biggest ballot question that was voted on in the November election in Boston had to do with, in Massachusetts, had to do with auditing the state legislature.
Can I add a word on that, though? Because, again, people are going to come to their own views however they decide to exercise their right as elected representatives, whether it's from conversations they have, through contributions, or in community, or whatever it is. And there's no way to know what's in people's minds. What I think is, to me, important about this particular example, though, is that senator and all of the Boston senators were sitting at the table with us in September in the Senate President's office alongside the 4 business groups. They did not say a word about concerns information that they needed or changes that they would want. Nothing was said. And then we were told to go get to a deal with the business groups. Then for weeks after that, back and forth, trading proposals, talking about what the deal would be. No additional feedback from any senators about what that should be, except, again, we've given our decision-making authority to the business groups to decide, and when they're good with the deal, the implication was we're good with the deal. We came to that deal, and then months after that, suddenly concerns surfaced, which might have been able, if there was should we plan ahead, if this ends up being in the lower part of your range than the higher part of the range, there was a window of 8 months for those conversations to happen, and we asked over and over and over again, what can we do? How do we be proactive about addressing and improving our proposal? And so for it to come at the last second in a sort of delay that then ultimately led to no vote at all hits very hard. The last thing, if I can, Jim.
Of course you can. Of course you can.
What was said constantly as the reason for delay and the reason for not wanting to do something that would clearly help residents and stabilize businesses as well was that there were, quote unquote, other options, right? So we heard over and over again, just cut the budget. If you cut the budget, then you can deliver that as relief to residents. But what people were not clear about, and what state tax law defines, which is why we're in the problem in this first place, is that the benefit, or let's say, if you cut $1 from the tax levy, if the city were to cut our budget and take $1 less, and need $1 less of taxes to pay for that budget, that decrease goes 2 to 1 to the commercial sector over residents. So if you're saying we know that there's a problem for residents, but just cut the budget, what you're not being clear about is that actually doesn't solve the problem for residents. It delivers an even greater decrease for businesses who would be getting a decrease this entire time. The goal always was that businesses were going to see a sharp decrease, residents would see a sharp increase, and all we were asking for was to moderate the rate of that over a multi-year period to stabilize it for everyone so people wouldn't be hit hard. And so the cut the budget was, it was really almost a fraudulent sort of continual push of there's a very reasonable way to avoid this, when that wouldn't have solved the problem that everyone was purportedly acknowledging. The other push now is, well, we'll just raise the residential exemption so that we can give more of a tax break to some residents. What that only applies to homeowners. And so when you do that, it then actually keeps all the burden on the residential sector overall, but pushes it from homeowners onto renters, who in many ways can be the most vulnerable of all. And so we had a solution that addressed all of this, that would have helped all the residents, stabilized everything, and the deal did not hold.
One last housing thing, and by the way, we have had mayors, governors, attorneys general on our show for decades. It's the first time we've taken so few calls. Our apologies, but these are really, really important issues that I think people needed clarity on. In a related housing development, we spoke to the Attorney General the other day when she was here about this decision by the legislature. Again, no hearing, no transparency, no nothing. An amendment filed at the last minute in the Economic Development Bill to give Blue Hub Capital, which does these shared appreciation mortgages. You're foreclosed upon, they buy the property from the bank, sell it back to you with a profit, and then they share in whatever equity you make. There's a lawsuit pending against them by some homeowners saying they're predatory lenders. Blue Hub Capital was granted exemption from the state consumer protection laws by the legislature in this last minute, again, no hearing deal. 119 of their mortgages are in the city of Boston. What was your reaction? And by the way, this is Beacon Hill legislature. What was your reaction to this, Mayor?
Yeah, I don't know all the details and ins and out of exactly what the issue is or what the alternatives are. I think in general it's a challenging look when any single entity gets a particular carve out, and so would want to know a little bit more there. I know that there are, when you're at the point of your home being foreclosed on, to have any option at all is a good option. But what are the provisions for then renegotiating that later, or being able to buy out an entity that helped you, or to then get that equity back? I don't know what the details are. I think it's maybe one more example where the sort of different use cases within the fact that different entities or different causes can be treated so differently by that process at
this
various
law only
stages.
applies to one company.
Right.
It's hard to think about all those who go through the process and don't get any response at all. I know there's hundreds of cities and towns who have various requests before, this body or that body, and I'm, want to find ways that the city can continue to be a place where we're building trust in the civic engagement process. And we have a lot more work to do on that
Are
front.
you going to show up in January or Zoom in or something? You're going to do something, right?
I'll be on my couch, and you can wave hi to the baby.
We promise you all we will take all of your calls. Our sincere apology, but I repeat, these are really important issues that needed clarity, and we felt it was important for the mayor to get an opportunity to explain her position. Mayor, we thank you much. If we don't see you before the kid pops, as you said, we hope all goes well for all of you, and thanks so much for your time. Merry
Thank you.
Christmas.
Thank you
Happy
very much.
holidays.